Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from ODESZA, A Moment Apart. ODESZA is the Seattle duo of Clayton Knight and Harrison Mills. Now, I do have a little bit of a personal history with these guys, having first discovered them through remixes of Pretty Lights tracks, One Day They'll Know and Lost and Found. Now, some may remember my review of Pretty Lights, A Color Map of the Sun. I recommend checking that review out. And while you're at it, check that album out as well. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. That being said, ODESZA's remixes of those tracks from that album, I just found to be okay. And it wasn't until their second album, In Return, came out and refused to budge from the iTunes electronic charts Lindsey Sterling style. In fact, this is still the case 3 years after the fact. They almost never left the top 10 in the interim period, seriously. But when that album came out, they did finally catch my interest. And that album was good. Not great, but good. Cue fan writing. While these guys had a wide instrumental palette that sounded really nice and created some great summery vibes, the album didn't really stick with me all that much. Only the lead single from that album, Say My Name, had any particular staying power for me. And, to be fair, even that track had the same tempo, chord progression, and was in the same key as Daft Punk's Get Lucky. I mean, while it still got a ton of repeat listens in spite of this fact years ago, I do have to still bring that up. I did much later get around to checking out their debut album, Summer's Gone, and by much later I mean in preparation for this particular video, and I was honestly much more impressed by that. Their style, while very reverb-heavy, as well as noticeably reminiscent of other artists, especially Bonobo and Tycho, is still nailed down in its atmosphere fantastically well and provided enough variety to leave me satisfied. In Return, meanwhile, upon return listen, is almost exactly the same, but not nearly as varied or interesting. Didn't get quite the same visceral personal enjoyment aside from, again, the lead single, as previously mentioned. So I love that track, and also the other track with Zyra, It's Only, was pretty good too. Otherwise, it just kind of felt like I was listening to variations on the same track over and over. Not bad, but still not great either. Going to this third album, I can't say I was out of my mind with excitement. To me, they're still those guys who wouldn't leave the top of the iTunes electronic charts for several years, and probably didn't deserve to be stuck there for so freaking long, even though I've now come to accept that the iTunes electronic charts are typically so static that you get like the same album occupying the #1 spot by default for like entire years at a time. It's just a thing that happens. But I digress. At least I know now that ODESZA have one really solid album under their belt in addition to the alright one I'd already known before. I hadn't heard any singles leading up to the album, but I know it got a ton of hype to the point of me seeing ads for this album on train rides. Jeez. So the question is now, how does their third album fare? I don't even know what to think about this album. Maybe better than In Return? It does feel like it has more variety than that one, but like that one, it just mainly comes off as okay? Shut up. It's honestly really tough for me to wrap my head around. There's a lot of good to be found here, but there's a lot of problems I have with it too. Very conflicted on it. There's some great stuff, there's some not so great stuff. It's just really all over the place for me. I know people are inevitably going to be disappointed at the fact that I don't think this is like the greatest album of all time, or even album of the year material. In fact, this comment section on this video, I'm calling it right now. It's most likely going to be ridiculously toxic and insane. Just a guess, though. I mean, would not mind being proven wrong on that one, but I doubt it. God. But that's why I've taken my time a little more with this video. I have a feeling it's gonna be in one of those reviews, because this is a band with a huge cult following that is able to get it so high up on the charts. So Yeah, here goes nothing. Let's talk about A Moment Apart. Alright, so first of all, I want to make it clear that I think this album is really well produced. They have a strong sense of atmosphere and a wide instrumental palette as they did with their other two albums. Chances are if you love those two albums, you will love this one too, if not even more. For me personally though, I'm starting to think ODESZA is a band that works better for me in shorter bursts than A Moment Apart provides. Their sound, especially on this particular album, is meant to sound super huge and grand and epic, and they have all these really big synth chords in nearly every track, and a sense of orchestral bombast in a lot of tracks as well. I mean, they are capable of going more subtle, see It's Only from In Return, but they very rarely do. And I don't know, the end result on this album was, it felt like it overstayed its welcome, got a bit overly long and overbearing. And this album isn't really that long, it's only a little under an hour, but it really dragged on for me. Repeat listens were able to help this a little bit. On first listen, I'd have described it as basically the more listenable version of Flume's Skin that had me falling asleep for a stretch of like 3 tracks. I think we've moved past that. But it still feels a lot longer than it actually is. Basically every track on here feels like it's trying to sound really big and important and epic, and it just gets tiring. On top of that, as I did say, this album does at least have a pretty good variety. They try for a lot of different world music influences, though I did later figure out that basically what they were doing here was their equivalent of Bonobo's Migration. And it's not like what Four Swords did by inadvertently putting grains in my head with his last album. I almost feel like I owe that guy an apology. Not that Bonobo was the first person ever to think of the idea of combining his style with a bunch of world music influences. I mean, it's basically the Banco de Gaia approach. It just doesn't seem like a coincidence that this act, who is obviously inspired by Bonobo since day one, decided to use the same idea for their new album in the same year. But whatever, never mind. Even if they did steal the concept from Bonobo, it's not like it's a bad concept or doesn't work to their advantage. It does definitely give the album variety and make it more interesting. I don't think this album fails on a conceptual level despite fairly blatant similarities to that other album. They had the right idea with this. So alright, we need to go in detail from an individual track basis, because this is where a lot of my issues go. See, like I said, there are some great songs on this thing, there are some okay ones and some ones, and it just goes all over the place quality-wise for me personally. So, there are instrumental tracks and vocal tracks on here. More of the latter, but I'm going to start with the former. Because most of my favorite tracks were instrumentals. Like, the opener and title track on this thing, absolutely stellar. That's a track that really pops out at you. It's a really energetic track that gets you pumped up for what you're about to listen to. Even has one of the catchier melodies on here. And I do have to mention the intro as well, which brings in like this slow ticking clock, or like maybe someone repeatedly putting a coffee cup on a table. Like just a... or more like... There's a bug on my windowsill. Yeah, this ticking clock noise or whatever, it appears in a bunch of other tracks and helps tie this album together a bit more. I will say I appreciated that. Late Night was also a really fun track. A really fast-paced and refreshing track that shows some of their taiko influence coming back, with these breezy guitars and a particularly driving bass line. Near the end, you got 2 back-to-back instrumentals, Thin Floors and Tall Ceilings, and La Ciudad, that I think really complement each other well. The former goes for a somewhat more subtle approach, or at least subtle by this album's standards. It still has a super bombastic orchestral section in one part, but it's one of the better uses of it, in my opinion. It's one of the slower and more stripped-back ones otherwise. Meanwhile, La Ciudad has a bunch of these playful melodies flying around. It's more energetic, but still carries those nostalgic vibes as well, yet also never going too over the top. So yeah, it's a nice contrast there. Not all instrumentals were winners for me though. Meridian had the potential to be one of my favorites with its very nice Asian and maybe also Native American influences. But unfortunately, there was one moment where they pitched the vocals up way too high, to the point of being really annoying. I mean, I can usually tolerate pitch-shifted vocals. There's not a single track on this album that doesn't utilize them. but I do admittedly have my limits, and that one was a little much for me. The other instrumentals, Boy and Show Me, go for a much more straightforward approach that doesn't come off as very interesting, and the hooks on both of these tracks get grating pretty quickly. So yeah, those two were some major low points on this album that I'd much rather skip over. Now for the vocal tracks, which took up a bigger chunk of this album than the instrumentals, which I'm gonna have to admit there were more I didn't care for than ones I liked. Now I'm gonna say there were 3 vocal tracks on here that I'd say I could, particularly get on board with. Though even these didn't hit quite the same heights for me as the best instrumentals from here. The best out of vocals tracks was probably Higher Ground. It's not as catchy as Say My Name, but it does definitely have the same sense of energy, it has a similar emotional effect. It also benefits from being early on in the album before ODESZA's sound starts to wear out on me a little. Even though instrumentally it's really not that interesting and doesn't provide any sort of twist on their usual formula. I liked the Mexican flavor of Everything at Your Feet, and thought the horn sections on this track were a nice addition, though I also kind of wish the vocals of the Chamanas, or however you say that, I wish they were more prominently highlighted in the mix. They're almost kind of in the background and feel like they're more part of the instrumental, which would be nicer if the instrumental was a little more detailed. Just, you know, still, it is one of the more subtle moments on this album, so I do appreciate that. The other vocal track I guess I liked was the closer, Corners of the Earth, although I'm a bit off and on with this one too. These guys of course closed out with the most intense and bombastic track of all, the orchestral tones and choirs and vocals from Rye X. It's a track that is obviously meant to sound super huge and expansive, and while it undoubtedly works, my only problem is that its effect is significantly muted by the fact that most of the tracks on this album are also trying to sound bombastic and epic, and by this point has just gotten overbearing. I don't think a different placement would have fixed things, probably would have made it worse, but I think its effect would be stronger if the album had fewer tracks. Also, Just a Memory with Regina Spektor was fine enough. It's an emotional ballad type track, good for what it is. Just, didn't really go beyond that, aside from, sounding big and orchestral like other various tracks on here. But now let's talk about the vocal tracks that did not go over as well for me. Line of Sight. It felt like it was trying to drag in Imagine Dragons fans or something. It was kind of a blander indie rockish thing that had a decent hook, but did not particularly draw me in. Across the Room with Leon Bridges. It should have been a moment of respite being more stripped back, but instead it's a sex song that kind of creeps me out a little bit, not gonna lie. And then Divide and Falls just don't do much of anything to stand out, and I feel the urge to skip them anytime they come up. Falls in particular gives me a particularly strong sense of deja vu. Like, it copied the melody of some already existing pop song in one area, but I can't be arsed to figure out what track that might be. All I know is that it got under my skin. So, closing thoughts. I think this album has a lot to like about it. Definitely got me thinking more and was more interesting than either of their previous albums. And it's by far their most ambitious effort. I do have to give these guys points for just putting a ton of work into this thing. And if you are able to handle the over-the-top and bombastic sounds of this album over 16 tracks, that's great, you'll have no problem. It's just that when I say over-the-top and bombastic, I don't mean that in, the Skrillex sense, where it's all random and crazy, or the Coma Duster sense with its insane attention to detail and darkness and weight. I mean that again in the Imagine Dragons sense. It sounds all huge and epic and carries some emotional weight, but for me personally, that emotional weight just didn't translate well to me. I mean, it's not as bad as Imagine Dragons, not even close. God, Believer is such a terrible song. But I'm just having a hard time forming any real emotional connection with this album. It just felt long and overbearing for me. I'll compare this to Bonobo's Migration again. That album worked a lot better for me because it was a lot more subtle. It feels more down to earth, and that helps the emotions carry across better, at least for me. Now, obviously I don't think that's what ODESZA are going for. This is clearly more of a synth-pop indie rock album trying to get you in the feels. They're trying to sound larger than life with this album, and it works sometimes, but for the most part, it just kind of feels thin to me. And just did not leave me emotionally invested. It's really tough for me to say, given how I feel like these guys are really talented. These guys definitely have something, but it just did not really work with me this time. I think it's better than In Return, had more highlights than that one, and was just overall more engaging and interesting, but I still prefer the much more simple charm of Summer's Gone. This album, I really don't know what to say. I mean, I like its instrumentation, and I typically love orchestral tones in electronic music, but some spark of life just wasn't there for me, and I can barely put my finger on why. Was it its ambition that killed it for me? Its mixing? Was it too overmixed? Was it his compositions? I don't know. I think it was just a little all of that, I guess. Now, if you do think this album is one of your favorites of the year, and it's amazing and perfect and all that, that's great. I definitely understand the appeal. I'd take ODESZA over a DJ Snake or a Flume or a Kygo any day of the week. And I'll have no problem if this thing ends up winning a Grammy, which it probably will, but I'd be lying if I said I personally came out of this album feeling much of anything besides Feel free to call for my beheading in the comments. I know tons of people will, and I'm sorry. I really wanted to like this album, but it just didn't click with me, and I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts anyway. So leave the comments in the comment thing down there. They're gonna be very angry. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.